Alright, and we're back to continue our study of society and inequality in Eurasia and North Africa with the slavery, the case of the Roman Empire. Okay, so why did slavery emerge in the first civilizations? Well, there are various theories as to why this happened in the first civilization. The domestication of animals provided a model for human slavery. War, patriarchy, and even private property ideas encouraged slavery. Large-scale warfare contributed to the growth of slavery as those first slaves were prisoners of war. And the patriarchal ownership of women may have encouraged slavery as well. So let's start with slavery and civilization. Alright, slavery was almost like social death. Complete total lack of rights or independent personal identity. And slavery was a long established tradition by the time of Hammurabi, which was around 1750 BCE. And almost all civilizations had some form of slavery. Varied considerably from place and time. Slavery existed in classical Greece and Rome. But slave emancipation was common as well. Even in the Aztec Empire, the children of slaves were considered to be free. And the labor that slaves performed varied widely across locations and time. So slavery is an old institution, but it increased dramatically as early civilizations and social inequality formed. Slaves are often described as having, like I said, like a social death, as they typically have no rights and they're deemed to be permanent outsiders of the society. And throughout the world and throughout human history, there have been numerous forms of slavery, making generalizations difficult. But it was considerably less common in China. Maybe 1% of the population were slaves. Usually that was the conflicts and their families were the earliest slaves. And eventually poor peasants sometimes sold their children into slavery, especially to pay off debts and things like that. In India, criminals, debtors, war captives, those were the slaves. This was largely domestic. Religion and their law gave some protections to slaves, not much, but some. And society wasn't economically dependent on slavery, like it was in other places like Rome, for example. So let's talk about the making of Roman slavery. In the Mediterranean and Western civilizations, slavery played a very important role. In the Greco-Roman world was a slave society. 1/3 of the population of classical Athens was enslaved, right? The birth of democracy. And Aristotle believed that some people are slaves by nature. So the rate of slavery was much higher in the Mediterranean world than in India or China. And slave ownership was widespread in Greece, with tens of thousands of slaves living in Athens. Like I said, the alleged cradle of democracy and individual liberty. Now, at the beginning of the Common Era, Italy's population was approximately 33 to 40% slaves. Wealthy Romans owned hundreds or thousands of slaves, and people of modest means often owned 2 or 3 slaves. So this is a vast scale of Roman slavery. Rome also saw massive slave ownership, just like in Greece. The Italian peninsula had a slave population, like I said, about 33-40%. And Roman slavery was often concentrated in the hands of the very wealthy, large landowners. And they were the ones that ran the estates and would have hundreds of slave laborers. So let's look at how people became slaves in the Roman Empire. Massive enslavement of war prisoners, piracy, long-distance trade for the Black Sea and East African and even Northwest European slaves, natural reproduction, and also the abandoned or exposed children. So, war captives generally made up the most slaves, but pirates and even abandoned children could be enslaved. And actually, slavery in Rome was not associated with a particular ethnic group. It was multi-ethnic. Slaves came from the borderlands of the ever-expanding Roman Empire. There was no single group of enslaved people. Like, for example, as the Africans were enslaved in the late world of the Atlantic Basin. Northern Europeans, Africans, Slavs, Jews, others, they could all be caught up in the Roman slave system. Now, within the Roman Empire, there's little serious social critique of slavery, even within Christianity. Slavery was deeply entrenched in Roman society. It was very important economically. There was so much cheap labor coming into Rome. Slaves could be found really in every sector of the economy, from manual labor in the fields to white-collar work in the cities, or even the gladiatorial blood sports of the Colosseums, or domestic work. So slaves did have all sorts of work except military service. Slaves were not allowed in the military, and they performed highly prestigious and even degrading tasks. And in Rome, slaves had no legal rights. They could not marry legally. If a slave murdered his master, all of the victim's slaves were killed. And manumission was common. Roman freedmen even became citizens. And now manumission is the act of a slave owner freeing his or her slaves. Okay, here's an excellent mosaic. And let's talk about what's going on in this scene. First, let's talk about these two figures. So we have a slave pouring a drink from a large vessel on his shoulder, or shoulders, right here, into the shallow bowl into the hand of his owner or his master. The slave is dressed in a short tunic draped over his left shoulder. His arms and legs and chest are visible. It looks like he's leaning forward towards his master and is looking at him. And probably if he were standing upright as opposed to leaning, he'd probably be taller and quite possibly stronger than his master. And see, he's dressed in a longer tunic that only reveals his lower arms and his feet. He's looking down at the bowl, and he seems to be paying little attention to the servant. So what does this mosaic tell you about Roman society? Slavery was the foundation of Roman society. This mosaic is showing an everyday example of the power relationship between master and servant. The master in this scene does not seem to wield physical force over a slave, but in fact it seems as if the slave might be stronger than the master. But the system of slavery was so powerful enough that it gave masters authority over their slaves even if they didn't have much physical force over them. Alright, let's talk about resistance and rebellion. Okay, resistance and rebellion. So there were cases of mass suicide of war prisoners just to avoid slavery. There were what was referred to as weapons of the weak: theft, sabotage, performing poor work, or putting curses on their masters. And these various forms of slave resistance can be seen in work slowdowns or sabotage. There were runaways that created a small industry in slave catching. And the punishments for slaves, like I mentioned earlier, for murdering their masters was extremely harsh. The victims, other slaves, were then killed. Flight was also possible, and like I said, the occasional murder of the owners. Now, one of the most famous rebellions, if not the most famous, was that led by Spartacus in 73 BCE. There was nothing on a similar scale that occurred in the West until Haiti in the 1790s when the slaves revolted there. So nearly 2,000 years later. And the Roman slave rebellions didn't really attempt to end slavery. The participants just wanted freedom for themselves. Now, Spartacus, like I said, the most famous slave revolt, was a rebellion of slaves that trained for the gladiatorial games. And Spartacus led this 2-year rampage of revenge up and down the Italian peninsula, freeing slaves, burning estates, killing masters, and once crushed, the Roman Republic crucified approximately 6,000 captured rebels along the Appian Way, and that was their warning to any future rebels. And so here's where you see in the dashed arrow the Appian Way. It's a major road there in the Roman Empire. And the solid green, those are the routes of the slave armies. It gives you a good idea of what's going on here. Alright, I will see you for comparing patriarchies.